A groundbreaking scientific study examined the conditions of patients that have experienced severe traumatic brain injury, crippling them to the point that they are stuck in a limbo and are deemed to be in a vegetative state. Although they open their eyes, they are unable to react to physical stimulus and exhibit no purposeful formulation of speech or body movement. However, when the patients were placed under MRI scans and were told to think of two specific actions that activated different parts of their brain, such as playing tennis or walking around their home, the researchers were able to observe the neural responses happening in their patient's brain, which signifies that they were, in fact, aware but not responsive to their surroundings. In addition, in a unique case, a patient made a miraculous recovery from this state, regaining his ability to physically move and verbally communicate. The stunning aspect was that he was even able to recall the appearance and names of the people who treated him while he was in the vegetative state. This leads to the knowledge question that we will be exploring today. When does a being exhibit consciousness? Is consciousness the capability to be sentient and physically react to stimuli, or is it simply being aware of oneself and the surroundings, when even there is no connection between the mind and the physical world? Does what a person remember dictate whether they were conscious in that specific time frame? Before we answer these questions, we must define the term consciousness itself. Aristotle had an imperialistic approach to consciousness. He believed that consciousness was derived from physical experiences of the world relative to the observer. If the observer cannot interact with the physical world, there can be no consciousness, as the mind is therefore isolated from the body and its surroundings. Applying this school of thought to our real-life example, Aristotle would say that the patient did not exhibit consciousness until he recovered from the vegetative state, and would refute the statement that he exhibited consciousness inside the MRI machine when he was asked to think about certain actions which showed brain activity. Although information was traveling in and being processed, the information could not find its way back out of his mind, indicating a severed connection between his mind and the world, deeming him unconscious. However, Aristotle did not have the technology like MRI machines to experiment with. Plato, on the other hand, believed that the reason why consciousness existed was solely for itself and by itself, which means that it must have the capability to have an impact on the world. Therefore, he concluded that consciousness is simply power. Back to our real-life example, Plato would argue that the patient's brain, although isolated from the rest of his body, is still aware and responsive, as proven by the phenomena that happened in the MRI scans. He, although in a vegetative state, is still conscious. Now, what does this all mean? Aristotle argues for the type of consciousness called access consciousness, which is described as the ability for our minds to communicate, reason, and react in relation to the physical world. However, Plato argues that consciousness should be defined as the qualia that can solely be experienced in the mind, separate from the physical world, which explains the functioning of the mind independently from the body. Descartes, on the other hand, would agree with Plato, but he introduces another criteria. His famous quote, "I think, therefore I am," explains that if a person is self-aware that he is thinking, he is, therefore, conscious. I believe this principle to be the fundamental test for consciousness in a being, and separates consciousness from sentience, which is the ability to feel emotion and react to external stimuli. A being can have the ability to think, to feel, and to react, but if the being does not question the act of thinking itself, a being cannot be aware of its own intentions, and therefore not exhibiting true consciousness. So, what can we conclude from our question? We know that the definition of consciousness becomes ambiguous under certain special circumstances, such as humans in vegetative states, and the true definition of it is debatable with schools of thought originating from ancient Greek philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle. There are two main points of conflict: access and phenomenal consciousness. One believes that the nature of consciousness should be defined by the being's ability to reason and react with stimuli, while the latter being the one that believes the consciousness is achieved through the experience of qualia. What is even more important is that by the way we define what consciousness is, we also change the way we treat these patients. This can be tied into the area of knowledge of ethics. Should family members still be given the right to decide when to end the life of a patient, now knowing that some, if not all, people are conscious even in this vegetative state, regardless if the patient cannot advocate for themselves? These conclusions can also be applied to the area of knowledge of artificial intelligence. Is consciousness solely biological, or can it be replicated through a machine? Yes and no. We can definitely program an AI to achieve access consciousness, and the access consciousness will eventually lead to self-awareness. However, phenomenal consciousness cannot be achieved, as machines cannot experience qualia like the biological counterparts. In order to experience qualia, the machine would need to have intricate chemical receptors that would provide the machine with an indescribable feeling, which is something that cannot be done or envisioned in the near future. This can also provide insight on the area of knowledge of natural sciences. When do human babies start exhibiting consciousness? This leads to the question of the way of knowledge of memory. Babies start exhibiting consciousness only when they start developing coherent chronological memories. This is different from sentience, which babies start exhibiting from the start of their life, such as crying and response to physical stimuli. However, if they cannot remember their previous thoughts, there can be no consolidation of personal knowledge happening, and therefore they are unable to reflect and build upon their own thoughts. And according to Descartes, if one is unable to reflect upon one's thinking, one cannot be deemed to be conscious. Thank you for listening.